The greatest danger during a crisis is not the crisis itself. It is how quickly human beings borrow one another's fear. Watch a crowd the next time something goes wrong. Not the event itself, but the people. Watch how the panic moves. Like a current, like a contagion. One person's trembling hands become another's racing heart. One person's desperate eyes become another's certainty that something terrible is about to happen. Within minutes, nobody can remember who was afraid first. The fear has become collective, and therefore it has become invisible. Nobody questions it, because when everyone around you is afraid, fear no longer feels like a response. It feels like the truth. This is the first thing you must understand about calm. It is not the absence of danger. It is the refusal to let the room decide your reality. What you are about to explore is not a technique. It is not a breathing exercise or a morning routine. It is something far older and far stranger. A pattern embedded in human psychology that most people live their entire lives without discovering. The people who remain calm in chaos are not simply lucky. They are not emotionally numb. They have not suppressed their fear. They have learned something about the architecture of panic that most people never see. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Let us begin. There is a concept in crowd psychology that researchers have studied for over a century, yet it remains almost entirely absent from everyday conversation. It is called emotional contagion. The idea is deceptively simple. Human beings are neurologically wired to absorb the emotional states of those around them. Not metaphorically, literally. This was useful once. When our ancestors lived in small groups on the open savanna, this kind of emotional synchronization was a survival mechanism. If one person detected a predator and fled, the group could not afford to deliberate. The fear had to spread instantly. The ones who paused to evaluate were the ones who were eaten. Evolution did not reward skepticism in those moments. It rewarded transmission. So the human nervous system became extraordinarily sensitive to the emotional states of others. A euro not because it made us accurate, but because it made us fast. The problem is this: the predators are mostly gone, but the wiring remains. Today, you are exposed to thousands of people's emotional states. Your colleagues' anxiety, your phone's endless stream of catastrophic headlines, the stranger in the waiting room who cannot stop checking the news, and your ancient nervous system cannot distinguish between the person who has witnessed something genuinely dangerous and the person who is simply afraid of a stock price. It receives fear. It broadcasts fear. And if nobody in the environment is modeling calm, the feedback loop accelerates until the room itself becomes the threat. Here is the hidden mechanism. Most people believe they become afraid because something is frightening, but often they become frightened because someone else is afraid. The sequence is reversed. The emotion arrives first. The explanation follows. The first practice of psychological calm is this: learning to distinguish between your own perception and the atmosphere you have absorbed. Carl Jung spent decades exploring what he called the collective unconscious, that vast, invisible layer of psychological inheritance shared across all of humanity. But he also wrote about something he considered even more dangerous in daily life. What happened when individuals stopped thinking for themselves and merged into the psychology of the group? He called this phenomenon participation mystique. The self dissolves. The individual becomes a vessel for collective emotion, and in that state, the person is no longer responding to reality. They are responding to the crowd's interpretation of reality. The next time you feel panic rising, ask yourself one question before you do anything else. Is this mine? You may be surprised how often the honest answer is no. There is a particular kind of person who appears calm in every storm. You have almost certainly met one. The colleague who doesn't raise his voice when the deadline collapses. The friend who grows quieter, not louder, when the news is bad. The leader whose stillness somehow makes everyone in the room breathe a little slower. Most people assume this person was born different, more resilient, less sensitive, wired in some way the rest of us are not. This assumption is almost always wrong. Marcus Aurelius, writing alone in his private journal in the second, said something that sounds almost startling in its simplicity. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. But here is what most readings of that line miss. Aurelius was not saying that outside events don't matter. He was a Roman emperor. He watched plagues decimate his armies. He buried his children. He fought wars for decades. He was not a man who had been sheltered from catastrophe. He was saying something far more precise. He was saying that the event and your interpretation of the event are two separate things, and that most people never realize this separation exists. People with an external locus of control believe that what happens to them is determined largely by forces outside themselves. Circumstances, other people, luck. When a crisis emerges, their entire psychological system looks outward for resolution. They need the situation to change before they can feel better. This is why they are so vulnerable to panic, because situations do not always change quickly, and in the waiting, the mind creates catastrophic narratives to fill the silence. People with an internal locus of control have developed the ability to focus on what they can influence, even when that sphere is very small. Not because they are in denial about external circumstances, but because they have trained themselves to separate the perception from the situation. They ask not only what is happening, but what is my response doing to me right now? And is it serving anything? The cognitive shift sounds minor. The effect is enormous. The calm person is not suppressing their fear. They are regulating their nervous system just long enough to keep the prefrontal cortex in the conversation. They have learned that the first victory in any crisis is not solving the problem. It is refusing to let the brain's alarm system make all the decisions. Something fascinating happens when human beings become afraid together. They stop being individuals. Researchers studying crowd behavior have documented a reliable sequence. First, an ambiguous threat appears. Second, people look to others to interpret its severity. Third, seeing others' fear, they confirm the threat as real. Fourth, the confirmation amplifies the fear. Fifth, the amplified fear amplifies others' fear. Within this loop, very quickly, nobody is reacting to the original event anymore. They are reacting to each other. Gustave Le Bon, the French social psychologist writing in the late 19th century, described this as the crowd mind, a collective intelligence that is, paradoxically, far less intelligent than any individual within it. The crowd is impulsive, credulous, and governed entirely by emotion. Le Bon noted something that should give everyone pause. Otherwise rational, educated, sophisticated people become fully subject to the crowd mind the moment they are submerged in it. The crowd does not take the worst of its members. It takes something from everyone. Jung encountered this observation and integrated it into his framework of the shadow. The shadow, in Jungian terms, is the part of the psyche that holds everything the individual refuses to consciously acknowledge. The fear, the rage, the shame, the irrational impulses that civilized life requires us to suppress. Under normal conditions, the persona, the social mask, keeps the shadow invisible. But in moments of collective panic, the shadow is activated at scale. People say things they would never say alone. They do things they would never do alone. They become afraid of things they would never fear alone. This is why intelligent people make catastrophically bad decisions in crises if they are surrounded by panic. The third practice of the psychologically calm is this: they consciously resist the pull of the crowd mind. Not by isolating themselves, not by rejecting the reality of collective difficulty, but by maintaining a sliver of independent observation, even in the middle of shared chaos. They retain one small corner of the mind that does not belong to the group. Jung called this individuation, the ongoing process of remaining a self, with a self's unique perceptions and judgments. Rather than dissolving into the collective, it is harder than it sounds, because the pull toward collective emotion is not just social, it is neurological. The nervous system wants to synchronize. It is the path of least resistance. Resisting it requires, at minimum, a moment of pause, a conscious interruption between stimulus and response. Viktor Frankl, writing from his experience in the Nazi concentration camps, described this as the last of human freedoms, the freedom to choose one's attitude toward any given set of circumstances. Everything else can be taken. That cannot be. Very few people realize this. The most dangerous moment in a crisis is not the beginning. It is approximately 5 to 10 minutes in, when the initial shock has worn off, but the full picture has not yet emerged. This is the window in which the narrative forms, and the narrative, once formed, is extraordinarily difficult to revise. Human beings are not primarily rational creatures who occasionally feel emotion. We are narrative creatures. The brain does not process reality as raw data. It processes reality as story, cause and effect, threat and response, hero and danger. The moment a crisis begins, the mind does not simply observe. It begins almost immediately to construct a story about what is happening, who is responsible, how bad it is, whether it can be survived, what it means. The problem is that this narrative is constructed under conditions of fear, with incomplete information, in a social environment flooded with other people's panic. And yet, the mind treats it as fact. Cognitive scientists call this phenomenon premature closure, the mind's tendency to stop gathering evidence once it has a story that feels sufficient. The feelings of certainty and the feelings of accuracy are not the same thing, but they feel the same, which is why people in a crisis are often most certain precisely when they are most wrong. The fourth practice reframes this entirely. Uncertainty is not a problem. It is the actual condition of being alive. And the person who learns to inhabit it without panic has access to something the panicked person does not. They can still think clearly. The Stoics called this reserve judgment. Epictetus, who was born a slave, and whose life was a continuous encounter with circumstances he could not control, spent his entire philosophical career returning to a single teaching: distinguish carefully between what is up to you and what is not. Apply your full attention and energy to the former. Receive the latter with as much equanimity as you can manage. This is not passivity. It is strategic precision. The person who panics scatters their energy in all directions. The person who is calm concentrates it where it can actually do something. Calm is not an attitude. Calm is a nervous system state. And the nervous system, unlike the rational mind, does not respond well to instructions. You cannot simply decide to be calm the way you decide what to have for lunch. The body has its own logic, and that logic, in moments of threat, is ancient and insistent. The fifth practice is the most embodied. Learn to use the breath as a dial rather than a passenger, not in the moments of crisis, but also in every moment. The practice before the event is what determines the access during the event. A nervous system that has been trained toward calm regulation does not simply snap into panic. The physiological habit, built quietly and incrementally in ordinary time, becomes the architecture that holds you when the ground shifts. Panic is a present tense phenomenon. It cannot exist without an urgent, immediate, all-consuming now. This is why panic responds so poorly to statistics. Why knowing intellectually that you are probably going to be fine does absolutely nothing when the emotional system is fully activated. And the panicked mind, by evolutionary design, wins. History is full of people who survived things they believed they could not survive, who later described, from the far side of the catastrophe, that the moment the panic broke was not the moment the danger passed. It was the moment they stopped trying to solve everything at once and started working within a limited horizon they could actually navigate. Here is where everything changes. Everything explored until now has been preparation, technique, practice, but there is a final element, and it is the most difficult to articulate because it does not belong to technique at all. The people who remain genuinely, sustainably calm in chaos, not occasionally, not performatively, but as a settled quality of character, have all, in one way or another, confronted their own relationship with control. Most human anxiety, if you follow it far enough down, is rooted in the same thing: the belief that you should be able to control more than you actually can. And when reality violates that belief, the gap between the expected control and the actual control is experienced as threat. The anxiety is not about the event. It is about the discovery that the world does not respond to your preferences. Jung described the shadow as everything the ego refuses to integrate. But there is a related phenomenon in his work that receives less attention: the inflation of the ego, the unconscious belief that we are somehow separate from the forces that govern everything else, that we are the exception, that we can, through sufficient effort and vigilance and planning, achieve a kind of immunity from uncertainty. The Stoics practiced something called negative visualization, the deliberate contemplation of loss. Not as morbidity, not as pessimism, but as a method of familiarizing themselves with the impermanence they might otherwise spend their lives pretending did not exist. By visiting the fear on their own terms, in their own time, with full rational awareness, they robbed it of some of its power to ambush them when it arrived uninvited. The seventh practice is the least comfortable and the most transformative. Sit, sometimes, with what you are most afraid of losing. Not to catastrophize, not to worry, but to look at it clearly and to know, with full knowledge, that it is not permanent, that you are not exempt, and that the quality of your life is not determined by whether you can keep everything safe. It is determined by whether you can remain yourself when you cannot. This is not a comfortable thought. It was never meant to be. But something extraordinary happens on the far side of that discomfort. The person who has genuinely sat with their own vulnerability, who has allowed the full weight of impermanence to register and has not been destroyed by it, discovers something that no external circumstance can provide. A kind of groundedness that does not depend on the ground staying still. Somewhere right now, in a room you will never see, someone is sitting with news that has shattered their sense of the future. Their mind is moving fast. The room around them feels uncertain. The people nearby are afraid, and they are trying to remember something they knew once, or heard once, or almost understood once, about how to stay inside themselves when the world outside is losing its shape. Those who remain calm during chaos are not born different. They have not been spared difficulty, or loss, or uncertainty. They have simply learned, through practice and sometimes through suffering, to stop participating in the panic that consumes everyone else. They have learned to observe the storm without becoming the storm. There is a reason you stayed until the end of this. Most people would have moved on long before now, distracted, restless, pulled back into the noise. But you are still here, and that tells you something about yourself worth paying attention to. What has been explored today is only the surface of something vast. That is what this channel is. If something here triggered your mind slightly, or shifted something you thought was settled, good. That disturbance is the beginning of understanding. Come back to the channel. There is much further to learn.